Okay, welcome back everyone. So we start this afternoon with evidence in chief from, is it Mr. Pearce? Yeah. Just to say we've had a look over lunch, we've had a few documents come in. I think they've all been cross-copied to everyone, so we've accepted them. Some as inquiry documents, some as core documents, so they'll be updated accordingly. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to introduce Mr. Pearce in a moment. You should have a full proof of evidence, a rebuttal, and I think there's a summary somewhere, but I have to say, I don't know where the summary is, but I think there was one, which I'm not going to refer to. So I'll introduce the witness. Is your name Martin Pearce?
I am, yes.
Great. And Mr. Pearce, in your full proof of evidence, you set out your qualifications and your experience, your degrees and so on, and you do tell us that you've been a consultant at Wood and an environmental consultant for 30 years, mostly in the field of air quality, and you've worked on a number of airport projects before, and you list them there, no need for us to read them out, and you led the air quality assessment in respect of the airport's application to develop the airport to 12 million passengers per annum and drafted the air quality chapters of the ES and the ESA.
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. And you then set out the scope of your evidence, and I don't think, to summarise that. The inspectors will have read it. Mr. Pearce, can we start by just talking about those areas where there are agreement between yourself and Dr. Brookfield, sorry. Most of the points of agreement, I think, are set out, aren't they, in the statement of common ground? Is that right?
Yes, I think that captures all the important ones.
And the inspectors can look at that. I think it's, Madam, I think it's section 1 is the main section for air quality. No need for us to go through that. I just want to then touch on one or two other things where there is agreement or near agreement. In addition to that, I discussed with Dr. Broomfield, sorry, I keep saying, I do apologise, Dr. Broomfield. I discussed with Dr. Broomfield this morning the modelling results, and we agreed that those were correct subject to the fleet mix point. So can we just touch on fleet mix? Firstly, can we just discuss, maybe you can just explain in broad terms what the aircraft contribution is to air quality impacts. How does it relate to the other sources of air quality at ground level?
Well, at Bristol Airport specifically, the aircraft naturally emit over the course of the airfield, so that's the stands, the runways and so forth. So the emissions are spread over a fairly large area, which broadly runs parallel with Lonsgate Bottom Village. The concentrations that you get from the aircraft contribution decline over a distance of a few hundred metres from the airfield. And so what you find is that you get modest contributions over quite a large area arising from the aircraft themselves. But they are pretty much confined to the area immediately around the airfield.
And so how sensitive are the air quality results? And I went through them with obviously Dr. Broomfield. How sensitive are those results to changes in fleet mix, first of all?
Well, we looked at in my note, we looked at Mr. Foley's new fleet and to see what difference that made on concentrations, and we found that it made a very small difference, which is presented in the note, of the order of about something like 0.2 micrograms per cubic metre in terms of NO2, and rather less in terms of PM2.5.
So can we just, I think we've now got it, I think it literally went on the website either this morning or over lunch, but INQ31, which was your note, I think. Yeah, technical note, comparison of effects. And Mr. Pearce, I don't want you to read through that, the inspectors will have read through it, but I'm just interested to pick up what the kind of broad conclusions are in relation firstly to NO2 and then secondly PM 2.5, as those have been identified as the principal areas of concern.
It doesn't change the conclusions of the assessment, basically. For NO2, Mr. Foley's fleet is actually slightly better in my calculations. PM 2.5 is very slightly worse. But overall, it doesn't really change the conclusions of the assessment in terms of the significance of these impacts.
And so if we turn to figure 3.1, which I think is probably one of the least interesting figures I've ever seen in a planning inquiry, there's a black line with a lot of blue dots, crosses, sorry. What does that show to the rest of humanity?
So where you've got a black cross that lies on the black line, that means that there is no difference at all between the concentrations in our fleet versus Mr. Foley's fleet. And the closer they are to the line, the less the less difference there is. And as you can see, they are very, very close to the line in all cases. They're slightly below, which on this chart means that Mr. Foley's fleet is slightly better. Gives slightly lower concentrations.
And I think you explain above why that is in terms of different aircraft types. And then comparison of PM 2.5, again, you get another of those charts, figure 4.1, where I think black and blue crosses are even more tightly.
Correct. Yeah. So the differences are between the two fleets are really very small. The other point which might be worth drawing out from this figure 4.1 is that the blue crosses are also clustered rather closely together, which indicates that the contribution of the aircraft to the total concentrations is a relatively small proportion of the total. And a lot of it comes from the existing background, which is nothing to do with the airport.
And so you conclude the note at paragraph 5.1.4 by saying the ESA provides a robust assessment and the use of the Jacobs fleet would not materially affect the conclusions of the assessment. So from your perspective, Dr. Broomfield, having agreed that the assessment of Mr. Brass's fleet mix has been correctly, accurately modelled, does Mr. Foley's fleet mix offer any material level of uncertainty around that?
No, my conclusion is that there's no material level of uncertainty in terms of the overall conclusions of the assessment.
And then there are two remaining areas of disagreement in very broad terms that I put to Dr. Broomfield. One relates to criteria for evaluation of results and the other to ultrafine particles, and I'll come to those in a moment. Before we do, I just want to pick up a few of the policy type points that Dr. Broomfield made, and for that purpose, and really just as a kind of aid to giving some structure to the points, could you look at your rebuttal? And in your rebuttal, section 2.2 sets out, under a number of subheadings, points relating to policy tests for determining acceptability. And the first point you address is a point that Dr. Broomfield made in his written material, and again orally in his evidence in chief, about compliance with limits, the air quality strategy objectives, certainly an important factor to be taken into account, but does not provide a complete assessment. And then you respond to that. Can you just, there's no need for you, unless you want to read paragraph 2.2.4, but can you just sort of take the inspectors through this, what the approach is and what in fact you did?
Yes, I think it's generally agreed that compliance with the air quality standards or air quality objectives is the first bar that you have to meet. It's the first criterion that you have to meet, but it's not the last one. And impacts below those levels do have the potential to be significant. And this is recognised in the IAQM and EPUK guidance, which you talked through this morning, which allows that impacts which remain below the AQO may still be classified as moderate adverse, for example. Yes, this is a reflection of the fact that there are potentially health effects below the AQOs. And so this is really an integral part of the assessment in a conventional, well-established and widely accepted way of taking this fact into account.
And then in the next of your paragraphs, you draw attention to paragraph 37 of Dr. Broomfield's evidence, where he says he concludes there's a clear policy commitment and direction of travel towards a tightening of air quality objectives. And he was there commenting on the clean air strategy. He set out some paragraphs in his paragraph 36. Again, we can see what your response is, but just get you to comment on that and whether there is a clear policy commitment, as Dr. Broomfield put it.
Yes, well, I agree that there is a direction of travel towards tightening the PM 2.5 limit. It's likely to come in as a result of the Environment Bill. I don't think we're at the stage yet where we can say there is a clear commitment to do so, because in the Environment Bill there is a test that any target that is set must be achievable, and there is work underway by DEFRA to try to determine what target would be achievable and on what timescale. This is still uncertain at the moment. It's currently considered that by DEFRA that, for instance, achieving the World Health Organization guideline by 2030 would not be possible under current the current business as usual conditions. So if a target of the World Health Organization guideline by 2030 were to be set, then that would have to be accompanied by a wide range of additional measures to make it deliverable.
And I think we can pass over paragraph 2.2.8. This was an accusation that the ES hadn't assessed things against the WHO guideline and references to the clean air strategy, and that's simply a timing thing, and I dealt with that with Dr. Broomfield. So aviation policy, again, you draw attention to various paragraphs in Dr. Broomfield's evidence there, and over the page he makes reference to making best use. And your paragraph 2.2.12, you make a point about trade-offs, and I just want to get you to explain that point, please.
Okay, well, so we're referring to the paragraph in making best use, so the government recognises the impact on communities living near airports and understands their concerns over local environmental issues, particularly noise, air quality and surface access. As airports look to make best use of their existing runways, it is important that communities surrounding these airports share in the economic benefits of this, and that adverse impacts such as noise are mitigated where possible. So I think this is an acknowledgement that there will be environmental impacts as a result of the making best use policy, but that they should be traded off against the benefits, specifically the economic benefits of making best use. And as I say, that it is important that these should be, the fact that they're wrapped up in the same sentence indicates that they should be considered as a whole rather than in isolation.
And then in the next of your paragraphs, you draw attention to some passages in Dr. Broomfield's evidence relating to the airport's national policy statement and schemes being compliant with legal obligations that provide for protection of human health and the environment. But then this air quality considerations are likely to be particularly relevant where the proposed scheme, and then a series of bullet points. Do any of those apply particularly in this case?
No, none of those conditions in the ANPS apply at Bristol Airport.
Okay, and then the next page, policy on air quality impacts of the development. Again, we go back to the NPPF there, and I think, again, this is the original version, so we all need to caution ourselves that the numbering, paragraph numbering is out of date. But if I take you to 216, where you comment on some of these points, 2 or 3 points here. You discuss the point about what is unacceptable, but you also deal with paragraph 170 as was in the NPPF, and development should, wherever possible, help to improve local environmental conditions. And this is an important theme in Dr. Broomfield's evidence, this position that there is, excuse me, position that there has to be an improvement in air quality or a reduction in emission levels. What do you say about that in terms of the policy support for such a proposition?
Well, a couple of things. First is that the note that the paragraph is addressed at preventing unacceptable levels of environmental harm, air pollution in this case. It doesn't define what unacceptable is. This is common to most other guidance, and is, one may infer that it's left to the judgment of the air quality assessor in the looking at the whole of the policy context and the overall impacts as a whole. There is also the important caveat that it should, wherever possible, help to improve local environmental conditions such as air quality, which, as I note, is not intended to be carte blanche to pollute as much as you like, but an acknowledgement of the fact that sometimes developments take place which have benefits which outweigh any adverse effects on air quality.
And then over the page, again, 2217, you introduce the concept of, or the local core strategy policy, CS3, and you draw attention to Dr. Broomfield's conclusion in his paragraph 103 to assess whether the proposed development would give rise to an improvement in air quality. The correct test is to compare the future situation if the proposed development goes ahead with the future situation. If the development does not go ahead, applying this test, I conclude the proposed development would give rise to increases in air pollution. Now, we obviously know from looking at the tables that there are higher levels of emissions, but is there some thresholds or some sort of criterion that says levels of pollutants must fall for something to be permitted?
There's no such criterion, no.
And you refer there to acceptability of levels, obviously, insofar as air quality feeds into a wider health impact assessment. Is air quality the only input to that wider assessment of public health?
No, of course this will be discussed later in the week, but the health assessment would also include socioeconomic effects, which may well have beneficial health effects, which in general could outweigh the adverse health effects of detriment to air quality. That's true in general. I'm not giving evidence on the health for this specific case, of course.
So let's return then to the specific criteria against which one carries out an assessment. Obviously, one set of criteria are the air quality assessment levels, the air quality standards and the air quality objectives. And let's just start with those. So what is one looking for there?
Ideally compliance. Where there isn't compliance, you would expect it to work, any development to work towards compliance. In the current case, there is very clearly compliance.
Yes. Are there any instances where there is even nearly a non-compliance?
No. A common threshold is, if I can take NO2 as an example, where the air quality objective is 40 micrograms, it's common to say that 36 or higher would be considered at risk of an exceedance. And there are no cases where it's above 36. Even in the environmental statement where we were predicting higher concentrations, the highest was 35. Another common threshold is 75% of the air quality objective, which is considered well below the air quality objective. And I think we are well below at all receptors, again, for all pollutants.
So it's still appropriate to look at air quality levels below the assessment levels, and you've done that, and I took Dr. Broomfield to the IAQM guidance. Just want to do the same with you, just so that you can explain to the inspectors what you've done and how you formed your judgments about various matters. So could we just look at CD 8.4, please?
Do you mean 8.4?
I don't think I do mean 8.4. I have written down 8.4.
8.5, hang on, sorry.
8.5 might be.
Sorry, no, you mean the IQM guidance?
8.6, I mean.
8.6, yes.
Just
Sorry, where we are?
very, very pertinent question. We should be at CD 8.6.
8.6, thank you.
Must have been getting late when I wrote this particular note for myself. 8.6. And I think we need to go to page 25.
Yeah, 25 has the table.
Yes, and you mentioned a few moments ago the concept of 75% of the AQUAL.
Yeah.
And if one looks in table 6.3, one can see that there are, down the left-hand column, different sort of percentage concentrations as against the AQUAL, and then across the top, percentage change in concentration relative to the AQUAL. Just for a moment, so the inspectors have it, just kind of talk them through what that is, and then when we look at the tables, there'll be an understanding of why you've come up with negligible or slight or moderate. So just talk us briefly through that.
Yeah, so as you say, the left-hand side, the key point here is that it's a matrix of the total concentration against the change in concentration. So both of these factors are taken into account. Generally speaking, if your overall concentration is low, you can then, a relatively large change is likely to remain fairly low, and so will be more acceptable than if your total concentration is high, where even a small change may be considered substantial. So this is the idea of this table is to acknowledge the fact that yes, you want to be below the air quality objective if possible, and to attain and sustain compliance, as the NPPF has it. But even where air quality is below or well below the air quality objective, it's still important to make sure that any changes are not excessive.
So I think one of Dr. Broomfield's original criticisms was that the assessment had focused too much on the standards and the objectives. Is that a fair criticism?
I don't believe that's a fair criticism, no.
All right. And then another criticism of Dr. Broomfield's, it's in his paragraph 37, I think, related to the direction of travel for PM 2.5. And again, we've touched on this, but very briefly, we know what the air quality standard for PM 2.5 is. It's the 25 micrograms. We know about, from the clean air strategy the direction of travel point, but has the clean air strategy or COMIAP or any other body set, first of all, a different assessment level?
No.
And insofar as there is a direction of travel, are you, when you apply the table that we were looking at in table 6.3, are you able to have regard to those sorts of things informing your judgment about what is significant?
Yes, again, I think that one should give a degree of weight to the World Health Organization guideline as a measure that is of interest and so should feed into an assessment of significance.
And did you do that?
Yes, in the first of all in the Regulation 25 and in the ESA.
And then another point that Dr. Broomfield made related to innovative solutions, incentives and ambitious targets. I don't want to traverse all that ground again, but in relation to ambitious targets for surface access mode share, public transport mode share, how are they reflected in the overall case that the airport is putting forward?
The airport surface access strategy feeds into the transport assessment, which was used as a basis for the ESA. So it was assumed as a form of embedded mitigation in the ESA.
And then two other things, the Carbon and Climate Change Action Plan and the Air Quality Action Plan. You just told us that the public transport commitments are taken into account through the surface access modelling in the air quality outputs, but what about the CCAP and the Air Quality Action Plan? Have you reduced the air quality emissions levels to reflect those plans?
No, clearly the CCAP is still in draft, and the proposed Air Quality Action Plan hasn't yet been drafted.
Right. So there was a debate about whether or not the Air Quality Action Plan would have any effect. Has any effect been assumed?
No.
No. Insofar as it does have an effect, therefore, what will that do to the various tables we looked at in terms of emissions?
That would tend to reduce the predicted impacts.
And then Dr. Broomfield's then relies on core strategy policy CS26 for, in part, I think, for a requirement to improve air quality or reduce air quality or various emissions. Is that an appropriate reading of that policy? Is there a requirement to reduce emissions for all forms of development?
That's certainly not how I read it, no.
Then let's just come to some of the results. Let's look at CD 2.20.5. I've obviously gone through these with Dr.
Broomfield, and there's little point in going through them again in detail, but there are some slight, in table 7A.1, most of them are negligible. There are very few slights in theirs. We can see one is H056, for example, and then there are some other H05960. I think those are downside road properties.
Yes, I think so, yes.
And just comment on those in terms of, you know, the process contribution and indeed the PEC and what that is, what that's showing us.
Yeah, so you're seeing that these are properties along Downside Road, I believe, and as such, the increase in the aircraft activity will result in increases in concentrations at these locations. The concentration or the increase is fairly modest, given that, but the key thing is that the total concentration is really very low. It's in the low 20s, a little over half of the air quality objective for NO2, and it's just, so in that context, this increase would be considered only slight.
Can we just consider how these levels compare with existing? If I can remember the right reference, I think if we look at CD 2.5.19, see if I can. Yes, there are. You may need to point me to which are most relevant, but in page 10 of that document, we get the monitored annual mean NO2 concentrations at various locations over time from different monitoring stations. I'm sorry. CD 2.5.19, if we go to PDF page 10, we can see some of the monitoring during the period, it's 2011 to 2017, and obviously these are a range of different monitoring points, but as a generality, how are the PECs, the predicted 2030 levels with the development, how would they compare with NO2 levels first now?
It's a little bit difficult to judge from the monitoring because they're different locations and they tend to be quirks of exactly where the monitors are located. A lot of the barrel ones, for instance, are within the car parks or locations where there's no public exposure. So generally the NSC ones are a bit more appropriate, although some of them are very close to the A38 road, so again, not necessarily representative of public exposure.
Maybe it's not easy to do it from that, but just as a generality, what's happening to air quality over time?
Generally, here, as across the country, air quality is improving across time. And more specifically, if you do a comparison of the model against the 2017 case, which is a like-for-like comparison, at almost all receptors, the air quality is better in 2030 with the development than it is in 2017.
If I'd been able to find the table with that data, I would have asked you about that. Do you know which table that is? Don't worry, we can supply it later maybe.
No.
But there is data. So, okay, on a like-for-like basis, the 2017, the 2018 data is higher. Back in CD 2.20.5, again, PM10s, which again I think are page 14 in those tables. I suppose with the first tables, I asked Dr. Broomfield in relation to NO2s, were the effects shown there not significant? You know, and I'm talking about obviously EIA, you know, likely significant effects. And he agreed. Was that the assessment in the ES addendum as well?
Sorry, what?
The NO2 effects are not significant.
The ESA concluded that the effects of NO2 were not significant.
Yeah. And PM10, again, we get all those results from page 14. We can see, again, the PCs and the PECs. Again, Dr. Broomfield agreed with me that in terms of likely significant effects, these are not significant. Is that again?
Sorry, page 14 is actually PM10. PM2.5 starts on page 19.
I meant PM10 if I said PM2.5.
But for both of them, all of the impacts are negligible.
So not significant?
So clearly not significant.
And then PM2.5, which is, I think, page 19. Yeah, PM2.5, page 19. Again, all negligible.
Yes.
Conclusion on significance?
So it's all negligible, so all clearly not significant.
And Dr. Broomfield seemed to make a point that, well, look, actually there were increases. And yes, we can see there are increases. But does that, in terms of the context of the policy we looked at, does that indicate any level of significance of effect?
No. Not on my understanding of any policy.
And then ultrafine particles, again, Dr. Broomfield accepts his paragraph 19, not a key pollutant, but again he draws attention to it as an emerging area of concern. And perhaps you could just, again, very briefly talk us through that. There is obviously emerging interest in this area, but where have we got to in terms of standards and indeed an understanding of this as a potential effect?
Yes, I think it's perhaps worth going into why we think it's emerging. It's not, Dr. Broomfield said earlier that there has been quite a lot of new research and new evidence developed over recent years, and that's correct. But it's not a new issue. If you look at the World Health Organization guidance from 2005, I can give you the CD, but I can't give a specific paragraph or anything. But that identifies ultrafine particulates as an issue even then, and identifies the ultrafine fraction of PM as being potentially one of the major contributors to the overall impacts of overall health impacts of PM. So, although the reason it's emerging now as an issue of interest, I suspect is mainly because much of the last 10 or so years, everyone has been worrying about NO2 and compliance of the NO2 EU directive limit value. Now that there is a clear pathway to achievement of that limit value, NO2 is considered less of an issue, and so the space has opened up almost for a shift in emphasis towards PM 2.5 and ultrafine particulate.
And you'll remember I took Dr. Broomfield to the Air Quality Expert Group report. We don't need to look it up, but it was CD 8.12, which talked about the relationship of PM 2.5 with ultrafine particles, and you've made the point, as Dr. Broomfield did, that ultrafine particles are a subset of PM 2.5s. What, having gone through the results for PM 2.5s, what does that tell us about the likely significant effects in relation to ultrafine particles?
Well, ultimately significance is due to the health effects of the pollutants in concern. Since the health effects of ultrafines are included within our understanding of the health effects of PM 2.5, logically it makes sense that the impacts of ultrafines must be considered not significant in the same way that the impact of PM 2.5 is.
And then just finally, some points on mitigation measures. The realignment of the junctions at Downside Road and West Lane, I think the position ended up with Dr. Broomfield accepting that the removal of congestion in those areas would be an improvement to, in air quality terms, to the properties around those areas, but not to properties remote from those areas.
Perhaps it's worth interjecting at this point that those are precisely the areas where the highest air quality concentrations are experienced in the monitoring and forecast in the modelling, because those are the locations which are close to the airfield, so you have an you have an aircraft contribution there, but they're also close to the major road, so you have the roads contribution. So you have the contribution from both sides, which is why you get the highest concentrations, and that's why the reduction in queues is particularly valuable.
And well, I was going to ask you whether that was valuable, and you've preempted that question, so I'll move on now to the airport surface access strategy. We know in the airport surface access strategy about the public transport mode share. Obviously, there are other parts, or can be other parts of that ultra-low emission strategy, electric vehicle charging provision, those sorts of things. Do those contribute to improving air quality?
Yes, to the extent that they're happening already, they're contributing on an ongoing basis, and to the extent that they're part of the strategy for the future, they will continue to do so.
And then in the CCCAP, again, can we just look at that? So that's CD 948. And if we start with page 20 of that.
Sorry, just a minute.
At 948. Actually, if we move on.
Sorry, yes, thank you.
So you can see on page 21 is the carbon accreditation scheme and Bristol Airport's journey. Pass over that, and I think if we get to page 24, there's the carbon neutral airport BAL scope 1 and 2, and then various measures on PDF page 26. This is part of Carbon Net Zero Airport, section 6.2, key measures, and some of them: zero emission fleet, and the measures in there identified, will some of those, which are actually in the CCCAP rather than the Air Quality Action Plan, but are those measures that would be anticipated to help with air quality?
Yes, indeed. So that will improve air quality, airside and landside. Some of these measures will improve air quality at some distance from the airport along the roads as well.
And then 6.3, we can look at short-term business as usual measures in table 6.1, and for example, the last one of those, implementation of an EV coach trial on site, again, is the encouragement of electric vehicle coaches. Is that, again, something that will contribute towards air quality improvement?
Yes, that will have air quality benefits.
And I'm not going to keep going through the document, but you can see various other measures. What about the air quality action plan? That's to be secured, we know, by condition. I think it's condition 16.
Yes.
Maybe firstly I'll ask you why is there not a draft of that? It was put to Dr. Broomfield, well, there wasn't a draft, you hadn't tested the measures.
Because it hasn't come up as an issue, essentially. NSE didn't ask for one, as I believe they asked for the CCCAP. And in my judgment, there isn't a need for one currently, given that we're predicting very small impacts, not significant impacts. So it would be premature and disproportionate to attempt to draw one up at this stage.
And you use the word disproportionate, and I put to Dr. Broomfield that policy point that mitigation of effects should be proportionate with the effects. Is the approach of there being a condition requiring us to produce an air quality action plan, is that a proportionate response?
I think it's a reasonable response. Just drawing up the plan obviously doesn't commit to anything, but I think a key part of drawing up an air quality action plan would be to look at what measures, what could be delivered in a proportionate way, in a cost-effective and effective way.
And we know that Dr. Broomfield has identified some ideas of things that might be included. Are some of those candidates for such a plan?
Absolutely, yes.
All right. Mr. Pearce, thank you. Stay there. There may be some questions, as they say.
Mr. Taylor.
Thank you, Madam. Mr. Pearce, good afternoon. Can I start, please, with things that have changed since officers considered the air quality position?
Yes.
Firstly, we know, don't we, that Bristol Airport Limited has produced changed forecast passenger numbers to take the assessment year from 2026 to 2030.
Yes.
We've got updated forecast aircraft schedules for 2030 for both the 10 MPPA and 12 MPPA scenarios.
Yes.
Yeah. And we've also got new total movements per year per aircraft type.
I can't remember if the total number of movements has changed. I'm prepared to take your word for it.
We've got updated road traffic forecasts.
Yes.
We've got updated aircraft engine emissions data as well.
Yes.
In terms of the looking at the effect of emissions from road vehicles, the method of doing that has changed, using the latest version of ADMS roads and incorporating the latest version 10.1 of the DEFRA emission factors toolkit.
Yes.
So a sort of generalised updating of the methodology.
Yes.
Okay. We've also, as I understand it, used the latest update of the DEFRA background concentration maps,
Yes.
and that feeds into the ground level concentrations that you identify in the ESA.
Sorry, it feeds into
That data feeds into the identification of the forecast.
Yes, it feeds into the total concentrations, yes.
Exactly. All right, thank you. Now, thanks for that. Now, generally, in terms of nitrogen dioxide, it's right to say that the government's been anticipating for many years reductions in NO2 to materialise with particularly improved efficiency of combustion engines delivering reduced NO2 emissions.
Yes.
Yeah? And would you accept that generally, and speaking very generally, the picture has been one of slow improvement?
It was for several years. About 2008, it became clear that the expectation that newer vehicles would be cleaner was not being met. I think it was 2013 that the Volkswagen Dieselgate scandal emerged, and suddenly air quality became front-page news. And that, after several years, this sort of really focused attention, and as of the latest standards, Euro 6C, which came into effect for all new vehicles sold after 2016, I think, we are which included a real-world testing, and I think it includes end-of-pipe sensors. The consensus is that this is delivering the improvements that have been expected for several years.
Right. Okay.
And so going forward, what we are finding is that cars are now, this is specifically diesel cars, I should say, are now meeting the sort of standards that we're expecting and are much cleaner than they were even 5, 6 years ago.
All right. Well, let's have a look at what's been happening at the airport. My learned friend took you to table 8.4 in CD at 20.5.19, page 10.
Okay.
And if we look at that table, it sets out the monitored annual mean NO2 concentrations over the period from 2011 to 2012. But I think we've only got a full set of data for 2012, so I'm going to focus on that. And we can see a number of stations down the left-hand side. Now, the ones that relate to the airport are the ones with a BAL prefix. Yeah?
Those are ones that are operated by the airport, yes.
Yeah. And if we look at those, every single station in 2012, the result is either the same in 2017 or worse, apart from BAL 3.
That's correct, yes.
Yes. So what we can see from that data, and these stations that they're described, if we go back in the to the previous table, I think it's on page 8. It explains where they are. There is land side, and I think the first 3 are air side. Then from BAL 5, it's land side. Those stations monitored by Bristol Airport Limited, that demonstrates that air quality over time, as the airport increases its passenger throughput, air quality is not reduced. Indeed, it has worsened.
Well, first of all, you're cherry-picking a single year, 2017. If you did the same comparison with 2016, you would get a very different result.
Right.
It looks to me as though most of them are lower in 2016 than they are in 2012. And in general, it is very unwise to use a single year of monitoring data to observe trends, because you normally expect quite a degree of variation from one year to the next. And what we're seeing in here is the sort of level of difference that you might reasonably expect.
So your evidence is that this data for the bowel measured receptors shows a trend of decreasing NO2. That's your evidence of this inquiry.
I haven't said that, no.
Right. It doesn't show that, does it?
I haven't checked that. I haven't said that. I would need to analyse the monitoring data a little bit more clearly to see what the trend is.
All right. Thank you. Now,
Sorry, if I may just clarify, what I said was that if you compare the the modelled data for 2017 against the modelled data for 2020, calculated on the same basis, using the same meteorological data, then you get an improvement in the future at almost all receptors.
Right.
That's what I said.
so that was the comparison with 2020 data, you were saying?
Sorry, comparison between 2017 and 2030.
Right. Okay. Yes, and that's because the emissions factor toolkit makes assumptions about the fleet of cars changing from petrol and diesel to electric, and it makes
Partly.
assumptions about increased efficiency of emissions from engines going forward.
Yes,
Yes.
I don't think the EFT, the emission factor toolkits, has a very large electric fraction even in 2030. I haven't checked the latest version, but certainly older versions had very conservative assumptions about electric vehicle uptake.
Okay.
I think it was something like 1% of the 2030 fleet, which is ridiculous. The main difference is, as I said to you earlier, the introduction of the Euro 6C cars, diesel cars, into the fleet. Every new car since 2016 has met that standard. By 2030, virtually all the diesel cars on the road will meet that standard.
All right. Let's look at the PM10 position, please, in this document. If we go to the next page, page 11, we've got table 8.6. And in 2012, we have an annual mean concentration of 18 micrograms per metre cubed, which is then exceeded in 2013, it's exceeded in 2014, it's exceeded in 2015, it's exceeded in 2016, and it's exceeded in 2017. So whatever way you look at PM10, it's got worse.
If you cherry pick 2012 as the year of your baseline, yeah. If you pick the average, it's hovered pretty much about 19 for the last 7 years. I would say that as being flat.
Flat, okay. So no improvement.
Without having done a proper trend analysis.
Right. Okay, fine. That's all I need from you on that. Thank you very much. Flat, great. Right, now from there, let's turn from looking at those numbers, see what's actually been happening whilst passenger numbers have been increasing, and look please at Dr. Broomfield's proof, page 12. And this is in his policy section. I just want to ask you some questions.
Sorry, 1 moment, page 12.
Page 12, yes. He refers here to, first of all, at paragraph 29, to an extract from the EU treaty, which refers to, which he says provides a useful aid to in the interpretation of air quality standards. And he refers to the action, this is out of Article 130R, action by the community relating to the environment shall have the following objectives. And it refers to preservation, protection, improvement of the quality of the environment, to contribute towards protecting human health, and to ensure a prudent and rational utilisation of natural resources. And it says that action by the community relating to the environment shall be based on the principles that preventative action should be taken, that environmental damage should as a priority be rectified at source, and that the polluter pay, and it goes on to refer to protection requirements being a component of the community's other policies. So we can see there as a general approach in EU law, the starting point is to take preventative action, isn't it?
That's what that says, yes.
Yeah. And the priority to prevent environmental damage is to rectify the issue at source. Yes?
Yes.
So if, for example, the emissions of air pollutants is going to cause harm, the priority approach under EU law is to rectify that at source. In other words, to take steps to reduce or prevent those emissions from being emitted.
A priority, not the priority.
Right, okay. Paragraph 30 next, Dr. Broomfield refers to the 2008 Air Quality Directive, and I'm not going to ask you questions about whether it's still in force and how we interpret it and all the rest of that. That can be something for everybody to look forward to later in this process. The second recital of the directive says, in order to protect human health and the environment as a whole, it's particularly important to combat emissions of pollutants at source and to identify and implement the most effective emission reduction measures at local, national and community level. So that too is reflective of the approach in Article 130R, isn't it? That it's particularly important to combat emissions of pollutants at source. Yeah?
That's what it says.
The one
I forgot
reflects
what
the
question
other.
is.
And it goes on to say, therefore, emissions of harmful air pollutants should be avoided, prevented or reduced. So, now Dr. Broomfield said that was a hierarchy. Do you agree?
I think that's a reasonable interpretation of that, yes.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Now, he also refers to the 11th recital, which goes over the page onto page 13 of his proof, and that specifically relates to fine particulate matter, PM2.5, and that refers to that pollutant being responsible for significant negative effects on human health. And it says this: further, there is as yet no identifiable threshold below which PM2.5 would not pose a risk. As such, this pollutant should not be regulated in the same way as other pollutants. And it goes on to say the approach should aim at a general reduction of concentration in the urban background to ensure that large sections of the population benefit from improved air quality. And it says, however, to ensure a minimum degree of health protection everywhere, that approach should be combined with a limit value, which is to be preceded in a first stage by a target value. So we've got a two-pronged approach to PM2.5 because there is no identifiable threshold below which it would not pose a risk. Firstly, there is an aim. The approach should be to aim at a general reduction of concentrations. Yes.
Yes.
And the second is to, in order to have a minimum degree of health protection, combine that with a limit value.
Yes.
But what we don't see here is an approach of, well, you just get to the limit value and everything's okay, do we?
No.
No. What we've got is an approach that requires you to continue your general reduction beyond the limit value.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's because, as it says in terms, there is as yet no identifiable threshold below which PM2.5 would not pose a risk.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, in terms of NO2, it is also the case, isn't it, that there is no identifiable threshold below which NO2 would not pose a risk?
My understanding is that the evidence on NO2 is less strong than it is for PM, but I'm not an epidemiological expert.
All right, well, let's have a look at it, shall we? Dr. Broomfield's proof, please, page 23. paragraph 75, he quotes from CD 815, a COMIAP report on NO2. The available evidence does not suggest that a threshold for effects exists at the population level. However, as only some of the studies have included formal tests for this, the possibility of a threshold cannot be ruled out. It was considered that any level of annual average concentration of NO2 would imply additional risk to at least some of the population, whether from NO2 itself, assuming that it has effect, or from covariant pollutants. Recent studies have shown associations of mortality with annual average NO2 at concentrations lower than previous studies had shown, and there is now evidence of associations in cohorts in which the range of outdoor levels reaches as low as 5 micrograms annual average NO2 concentrations. Dr. Broomfield says at paragraph 76 that indicates there's either no threshold or at best a very low threshold. Would you agree?
So I'm just checking his paragraph 76. I don't think that he says the evidence indicates that there is either no threshold or a very low threshold. It clearly says in the COMIAP quote, the possibility of a threshold cannot be ruled out. Mm-hmm. So I'm not quite sure that that's correct.
You're not quite sure that the threshold will be very low?
I'm not quite sure that what Dr. Broomfield says at paragraph 76, his second paragraph, is correct. He says the evidence indicates there is either no threshold or at best a very low threshold.
Yeah.
Whereas that's not my reading of the COMIAP quote that he has given.
I see. Your reading is that there is a high threshold, is it?
Either there is, if there is a threshold, I don't know if there's a threshold or not. I haven't gone into the detail of the research that underlies this.
What do you think we should make of the reference that COMIAP made to research showing evidence of association in cohorts in which the range of outdoor levels reaches as low as 5 micrograms per metre cubed then?
Well, I have to take the COMIAP report at face value.
Yes, that suggests that there are impacts when people are subjected to levels as low as 5 micrograms per metre cubed as an annual average, doesn't it?
Well, it suggests that some studies have found that.
Yes. And so that forms the basis, doesn't it, for, self-evidently, for Dr. Broomfield's conclusion that the evidence indicates that there's either no threshold for the effects or at best a very low one.
I'm not sure that a few studies is conclusive, but I think the evidence on this is still open.
And what do you make of the first sentence? The available evidence does not suggest that the threshold for effects exists at the population level. What does that mean? If it doesn't mean that the evidence doesn't suggest that the threshold exists? It means what it says, doesn't it, Mr. Pearce?
Well, as the second sentence clarifies, there is the available evidence is weak.
Where does it say weak?
Well, only some of the studies have included formal tests for this.
Right, it's that saying...
Therefore, the possibility of the previous sentence being incorrect cannot be ruled out.
The possibility of a threshold cannot be ruled out.
Yes, in other words, the previous sentence being incorrect.
And then it says it's considered possible that any level of annual average concentration of NO2 would imply risk to at least some of the population. That suggests that there is no threshold for the entirety of the population, doesn't it?
Yes, it's certainly considered possible.
Okay, thank you. Now, if it's right that there is either no identifiable threshold for NO2 or the threshold is very low, an approach of simply requiring compliance with the current NO2 annual average limit would not be consistent with the approach that we can see in the 11th recital of the 2008 Air Quality Directive, would it?
Sorry, remind me what the 11th recital was again.
It's at the top of page 13 of Dr. Broomfield's evidence.
So you're suggesting that NO2 should be approached in the same way as PM2.5?
Yes, for precisely the same reasons.
That would be a reasonable conclusion, yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Right. Thank you. Now, let's move on to national air quality policy. We've got the Clean Air Strategy of 2018. And on page 14, Dr. Broomfield quotes from some passages there. I just want to take you through some of those.
Sorry, you're still looking at Dr. Broomfield's proof?
I am, yes. Still talking, I'm afraid, about policy with you,
Okay.
rather than the numbers or the methodology or anything like that. We will come to some of that. Paragraph 36 of Dr. Broomfield's proof, page 14. We've got the National Clean Air Strategy, and he looks here at PM 2.5. And we can see reference to all ambitions to reduce average population exposure will deliver positive health benefits. And it says that's why we've signed up to meeting ambitious emissions ceilings, and why we now want to go further by setting a new world-leading goal to reduce human exposure to PM 2.5. So do you read that in the same way that I do, that what is being pursued is a general policy to reduce human exposure to PM 2.5?
Yes, effectively what the Clean Air Strategy is doing is exactly what Recital 11 suggests, whereby you have a limit value which is supplemented by a population exposure target. So those are the two prongs of Recital 11.
Yes, exactly. So we have a target, and we also seek to go beyond that target by means of a general reduction of concentrations.
Exactly.
Right, thank you. And indeed, as we go, if we look at the very bottom of this page, we can see precisely that. There's a reference to them looking to publish evidence early in 2019 to examine what action would be needed to meet the mean guideline limit of 10, and to use this to set a new ambitious long-term target to reduce people's exposure to PM 2.5 even further. In other words, beyond the 10 micrograms per metre cubed.
I'm not sure that's... Let me read that again. I'm not sure when it means even further, it means even further than 10 micrograms or even further than they have already reduced it.
Right. Okay, well...
That seems a point of ambiguity.
I've put to you that it's even further than the 10 micrograms per metre cubed, but you're not sure whether that's right.
It seems ambiguous to me.
Right, okay. Next it goes on to say, we'll review our progress in 2022, setting out detailed interim objectives and reporting publicly on our progress. This will set a clear national ambition to drive down human exposure to PM 2.5 as rapidly as is feasible. So again, we see there a reference to what you referred to earlier as an aim for a general reduction of exposure to concentrations of PM 2.5, don't we?
You say a general reduction, sorry, a reduction in human exposure
Yes.
to PM 2.5,
Yes.
yes. In other words, which I'm sure the inspectors realise this just means that you concentrate on concentrations where people live rather than worrying too much about isolated places.
And we do that as rapidly as is feasible.
As rapidly as feasible, indeed.
Okay. Thank you. Now, let's move on to look at the National Aviation Policy. And we can see from the APF and the quote that Dr. Broomfield's got from that on the bottom of his page 15 over to 16, that there's a reference to NOx emissions from aviation-related operations reducing rapidly beyond the immediate area around the runway. Road traffic remains the main problem with regard to NOx. Airports are large generators of surface transport journeys and as such share responsibility to minimise the air quality impact of these operations. So there's a responsibility to minimise the air quality impact of the surface transport journeys, is how I read that.
I agree with that, yes.
Yeah, okay. And the government expects them, that's to say airports to take this responsibility seriously and to work with the government, its agencies and local authorities to improve air quality. So what this paragraph is saying is that the main problem in terms of NOx emissions are surface transport journeys. The airports have a duty to minimise the air quality impacts of those with a view to improving air quality.
Yes, with a view to improving air quality, amongst other things, yes.
Thank you. At paragraph 43, Dr. Broomfield made a point about the APF and its attitude to particulate matter, where it says the particulate matter limits are largely met. In the light of the discussion you and I have already had this afternoon, it wouldn't be right to think that that approach of, well, we've met the PM annual limit values, and so we don't need to worry about it. That approach wouldn't be up to date, would it?
I'm not sure that sort of the situation has changed very much, certainly not for the worse since 2013.
Right.
I'm not sure what the full quote of the context of that quote is, but
I see. So
I accept that if, or to the extent that it says that PM is not an issue, then that's not an appropriate test going forward.
It's not an appropriate test. Right, okay. For example, we've got the Clean Air Strategy 5 years later, haven't we, and the passages that we've just been through.
Yeah.
And what that says about driving down exposure to PM 2.5, and that's a difference that the APF doesn't reflect, couldn't reflect.
Yes, as I say, in 2013 there was a lot of, as I stated earlier in my evidence in chief, in 2013 there was a lot of concern about NO2, and PM was somewhat on the back burner at that time.
All right, thank you. Okay, let's move on then to paragraphs 45 and 46 of Dr. Broomfield's proof. In paragraph 45, he quotes from Next Steps Towards an Aviation Strategy, CD 6.3, which is from April 2018. There he identifies what he describes as a more generic commitment. In parallel, the government must ensure that growth is sustainable and is balanced with local and global environmental concerns. The government has an important role in ensuring the negative impacts of aviation are mitigated. At a local level, aviation noise is the key environmental concern, and the government will consider whether the right regulations, controls and incentives are in place to ensure the sector continues to address noise impacts, as well as tackling air quality concerns. So we've got a reference to the need to tackle air quality concerns there, yes?
Yes.
And in the next paragraph, there's a quote from section 6.25 of the same paper. The aviation sector should play an appropriate role in managing the emissions that it can control.
Yes.
Yes. And so when we see those two elements, tackling air quality concerns and managing the emissions that it controls, we have to read those in the context, don't we, of the general approach that's appropriate to both PM 2.5 and NO2, of not just meeting limit values, but also driving down exposure beyond that.
Yes, and that is part of the wider context that
Thank you.
those need to be taken in.
All right, thank you. Now, next I want to take you please to page 18 of Dr. Broomfield's proof, and to
18.
18, 1-8, yes. Here he's got an extract from Aviation 2050, and we've already just had some discussion on this earlier today. And as we've seen, this paragraph falls within the context of considering surface access strategies. And 3.101 says the government expects airports to make the most of their regional influence to provide innovative solutions and incentives against ambitious targets which reduce carbon and congestion and improve air quality. So the objective of policy here is an improvement in air quality, isn't it?
One of the objectives, yes.
Yes. As well as the reduction of carbon and congestion.
Yes.
Right. And it's clearly looking at ambitious targets, plural, to be adopted, isn't it?
Yes, it's
A number of targets can be adopted to achieve the aims of reducing carbon, reducing congestion and improving air quality. No?
That's not a quote, is it?
That's what I'm saying.
Yes.
That's what I'm putting to you.
That's your paraphrase, yes.
Yeah.
That's accurate.
Okay. Now, in order to measure then whether your goal of improving air quality is ambitious or not, you've got to have a target, haven't you? The goal is to achieve an improvement of air quality, and you've got to have an ambitious target to achieve that goal, don't you?
The ambitious target, as I read that in context, is a target for the surface access.
Right.
And the specifically the public transport.
And in order to judge whether that's ambitious or not, you have to know how far it will deliver improvements to air quality.
No, how you judge to judge whether it's ambitious or not, you evaluate whether it's ambitious in the context of a surface access target.
Well, if your surface access plan only delivers, you know, a tiny change of 0.0001 micrograms, you might not describe the target it contains as ambitious, might you not? Whereas if it achieved a 20 microgram reduction, then it might well be ambitious.
The question of whether it's ambitious depends on not on the air quality effect, but on the effect on the surface access. So an increase in public transport share of 2.5% might be considered ambitious if, for example, that is what you think is the best that could be achieved. And that is pretty much the definition of ambitious.
I see. So you derive...
And so the ambitious target should be set against as I say, the surface access, not measured on the air quality effects.
I see. So what you're saying there is that you formulate your ambitious targets without regard to the degree to which they would reduce carbon, reduce congestion, or improve air quality. You have no goals.
I'm saying the test for whether it's ambitious or not is not the test for its effect on air quality.
Right, that's very, very helpful. Thank you very much. Madam, I don't know what time you're looking for a break, but would that be a suitable moment?
Now's a good time. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Okay, we'll come back at 5 to 4 then.
Thank you.
Mr Taylor.
Thank you. Mr Pearce, just a few more questions about targets, if I may.
Okay.
You've explained your position in relation to targets. And as I understand it, where the explanation for the reason that there are no targets to drive down emissions of PM and NO2 identified in your evidence is that you don't see that as a requirement of policy.
Sorry, are you saying in the context that there are no targets set currently in my evidence?
Yes. No emissions reductions targets for PM or NO2.
For the same reason that I said in my evidence in chief in the context of an air quality action plan, that first of all, no one has sort of requested any targets. NSC haven't indicated any desire that BAL should set targets. And secondly, the conclusions of the assessment are that the air quality impacts are not significant, and as such, in my judgment, targets are not needed at this point.
Yeah, I think it's further than that, though, isn't it? From the discussion we've just had, my understanding is that no targets to drive down emissions of NO2 or particulate matter are proposed by Bristol Airport Limited if permission is granted for the appeal scheme, because Bristol Airport Limited considers that such targets are not a requirement of policy.
I'm not aware of any policy that sets a requirement
Exactly.
for it to set in such
that's
targets.
right. So the answer to my question is yes, that's right.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And so that must mean that the appeal scheme was not designed with the objective of driving down emissions of PM and NO2 to achieve any particular air quality targets. Is that right?
It wasn't designed to achieve any particular air quality targets.
Okay. Now, just while we're thinking about whether there is policy in relation to emissions, if we have a look at CD 6.5, which is the Aviation 2050 document, and turn in the PDF to page 84, please.
84.
84.
Yep.
6.5. You should have paragraph 3.127 and 5 bullet points.
Sorry, 84 is a blank page in mine.
Oh.
It's not in mine.
I must be looking at what? Aviation 2050.
It's internal page 82, PDF page 84.
Oh, sorry, yes.
Paragraph 3.127.
Yeah, gotcha.
So this is under the heading Proposed Measures. It says the government recognises the need to take further action to ensure aviation's contribution to local air quality issues is properly understood and addressed. And it's proposing the following measures. And the third bullet point says requiring all major airports to develop air quality plans to manage emissions within local air quality targets. This will be achieved through establishing minimum criteria to be included in the plans. So this document identifies a need for major airports to develop air quality plans to manage emissions within local targets, doesn't it?
Yes, of course this is a consultation document, not current policy.
Right.
But I agree it is likely to become policy. It's a reasonable policy to make. This is why I believe it was BAL that suggested creating an air quality action plan rather than an SE. Right.
So at present, my understanding is that BAL doesn't have an air quality plan. Is that right?
I think it has developed some air quality plans over the years, but I don't think it has a current active one.
I think it produces a sort of annual report that consists of about a page and a half of A4, which reports the various monitoring exercises it's been under. But it doesn't have a plan which sets targets and identifies specific measures to achieve those targets, does it?
I believe that's correct, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Is that because Bal isn't a major airport, the Bristol Airport is not a major airport, and so this policy doesn't apply? Or is it just that Bristol Airport Limited thinks it is a major airport, but it's not got around to it yet?
Well, as I say, first of all, it isn't policy yet.
All right.
And I'm sure that when it is policy that, or if not before, it will be adopted by BAL.
Okay. Right, thank you very much indeed. Now, let's move on to the MPPF. Now, we've got relevant extracts from that. I think I'm going to use Dr. Broomfield's proof again, if that's acceptable to everybody. Lost my page number though, so
Page 19.
it's thank you very much. That's very helpful. Page 19, and I wanted to start, please, by looking at paragraph what was 170, now 174, and it says at the top, planning policies and decisions should contribute to and enhance the natural and local environment by. Now we need to note that, don't we, because this policy applies not just to decision making, but also to the formulation of development plan policy, doesn't it?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. And at 170, now 174E, preventing new and existing development from contributing to being put at unacceptable risk from or being adversely affected by unacceptable levels of air pollution. Now, I just want to explore that part, and we'll come on to the second part later. What is unacceptable? An unacceptable level is not defined in the MPPF, is it?
No.
And so, when a local planning authority formulates its development plan policy, it has discretion locally at defining what an acceptable or unacceptable level of pollution may be.
I'm not sure if it has discretion to make a unilateral decision on that. I'm not sufficiently conversant with planning policy to know that, but
Right.
I would think that it may have some discretion, but I would also expect it to take into account the broader consensus across England.
Any judgment that it made as to what was an unacceptable level would go through the plan process. It would be subject to the soundness tests that inspectors put plans through.
Okay, thank you.
And then would eventually get adopted as policy. Yeah?
Thank you, yes, sir.
Right, thank you. And we'll come on to look at the implications of that in a moment. Let's look at the next part of 170/174E, and should, wherever possible, help to improve local environmental conditions, such as air and water quality. Now, it's the phrase there, wherever possible, I want to explore with you. That means wherever it is feasible to do so, in a practical sense. Yes?
Well, it's wherever possible. I'm not sure if feasible is exactly the same word, exactly the same meaning.
That policy approach requires an assessment of what is possible and what is not possible.
I guess that's implicit, yes.
Yeah, and it is what is possible that has to come forward in order to comply with that element of policy.
Yes.
Now, in terms of the work that you've undertaken, Dr. Broomfield, in his proof at pages 35 and 36, he sets out a number of measures which he drew from sustainable aviation, their report from 2017 UK Aviation and Air Quality.
Yes.
Yeah? And Bristol Airport Limited is a member of Sustainable Aviation.
Yes.
And so well aware of the content of this document as
I'm
a
sure
member
I
of that
am.
organisation, yeah?
Yes.
Now, we can see on pages 35 and 36 a large number of potential measures. And yet, in your evidence, and indeed nowhere before this inquiry, is there any assessment of whether any of these is possible, or any evidence that demonstrates that any of these points are not possible? That's right, isn't it?
That's correct.
Right. Thank you. And so, if we come back to the MPPF and 170E, and what it says on page 19 of Dr. Broomfield's proof, you haven't demonstrated, have you, that Bristol Airport Limited is proposing the measures that are possible to help improve the local environmental conditions in terms of air quality?
Not yet. It
No.
has committed, or it is proposing to commit as a condition to undertake to do so as part of the Air Quality Action Plan,
Right.
which I would expect to include an assessment of measures such as those that Dr. Broomfield presents,
Yeah.
and an assessment of whether they are possible, whether they are feasible.
Yeah. So, when the inspectors come to judge whether the developments proposed has wherever possible helped to improve the local environmental conditions in relation to air, they can note that there is no assessment before them now.
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay. And that the proposal is that issue will be just kicked off into the future at some point.
Well, within 6 months of
Within 6 months of a grant of permission, I
Yes.
think it is currently formulated.
yes.
So they're being asked to grant planning permission for a scheme which, on your own evidence, increases the ground level concentrations within the local area, pollutants for which there is either a very low threshold or no threshold, without knowing what the content of an air quality action plan is going to be. That's the BAL's position.
That's the case, yes.
Right. Okay. Thank you. And in terms of the proportionality of action, you've already said there's no assessment of what's possible. There's no assessment of what's not. There's no assessment of what is proportionate for this inquiry either, is there?
Again, I would expect that to be part of the development of the action plan.
Do that later. Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you. Now, let's move on from that and just look at the results, just briefly, of your assessment. As I understand it, allowance has been made in the air quality forecast for the road improvements, the realignment of the roads in relation to the junction of Downsize Road. Is that right?
That's correct.
But there's no allowance for the air quality action plan because it doesn't exist.
That's correct.
And there's also been allowance for the surface access strategy by effectively assuming a 17.5%, the delivery of the 17.5% public transport share target. Is that right?
I can't quote off the top of my head whether it's the 17.5% is assumed in the traffic modelling, but I believe so.
Right. Okay. Well, with that caveat, that's fine. Okay. So that's just so we understand the points in relation to what you've taken into account. Now, in terms of the results, Dr. Broomfield summarises the position in his proof of evidence at page 23 in relation to NO2. I just want to see whether you disagree with the way he puts it in paragraph 73. he explains that all potentially relevant locations will comply with the air quality standard of 40 micrograms per metre cubed. It's forecast to have a range of effects, resulting in a range of changes of between minus 1.4% of the air quality standard to an increase of 7.8% of the air quality standard. An improvement in air quality is forecast at only one of 138 human exposure locations. That's the table we were looking at before. At the remaining, the proposed development will result in a worsening of air quality. That's a factually correct description of the results in the ESA, isn't it?
To be honest, I haven't checked that, but I'm prepared to believe it's accurate.
Thank you, that's very kind. So we do see, don't we, that the grant of planning permission here, in relation to NO2, where, as you've already agreed, there's a policy thrust of continuing to reduce exposure, results in increased exposure.
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay. In relation to a particular matter, Dr. Broomfield addresses that on page 24, my note says. At paragraph 79, we've got a similar paragraph. Goodness me, the air conditioning just switched off and I'm suddenly very loud. The ES addendum indicates that by 2030, PM10 levels at all potentially relevant locations will comply with the air quality standard of 40. The PM 2.5 levels are forecast to comply with the national air quality standard of 25. Levels at 2 of the assessed locations were forecast to be above the WHO guideline of 10, and the proposed development would result in a slight increase in PM 2.5 levels at both of those locations. That is an accurate statement of the contents of the ESA, isn't it?
Yes, I think perhaps where he says a slight increase in PM 2.5 at the 2 locations where it's above 10, it's an extremely small increase.
Right, okay. At 80, he goes on to say the proposed developments forecast have a range of effects on levels of PM10 and PM 2.5, resulting in a range of changes of PM10 between minus 1% of the air quality standard to an increase of 2% of the standard, and in respect of the range for PM 2.5 levels of between minus 2.2 of the WHO guideline to 4.9% of the WHO guideline. And he says an improvement in air quality is forecast at only 4 of the 133 locations for which data were provided in Table 7A.3 and at 124 locations the proposed development would result in a worsening of air quality. So that's correct as well, isn't it?
Again, I haven't checked that specifically, but I've no reason to doubt it. It's correct.
Thank you. And so, again, same question I put to you in respect of NO2. We're in a context where the thrust of policy is to drive down human exposure to PM 2.5, and the grant of permission for this development will result in an increase.
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Right. Now, let's just put that in the context of the development plan, because after all, we are operating in a development plan-led system. I want to take you, please, in Dr. Broomfield's proof to page 21. And at paragraph 65, he refers to the North Somerset vision, which sets out North Somerset's Partnership's Sustainable Community Strategy for 2008 to 2026. And he identifies the vision is for sustainable, inclusive, safe, healthy, prosperous communities thriving in a quality environment. And he says the SCS goes on to highlight a shared priority of improving health and well-being. And he refers to a survey that was carried out to develop the shared priority, improve road safety and reducing traffic fumes as well. Now, with that in mind, can we just take out CD 5.1 6, which I think is the core strategy, but I think we've got it in 2 places. I think it's also CD 520 for some reason. I don't think it makes any difference, but let's use CD 520 if you've already got that one out. And in that document, I want to go to page 16, please, in the PDF.
Page 16.
16. And this is chapter 2 of the core strategy, visions and objectives. And it says, this
Just a
section
minute,
takes... Sorry, I'll wait for you, sorry. Page 16.
Okay, yep.
You there? At 2.1, it says, this section takes the issues and challenges facing the district and describes the visions to guide objective setting and policy development. And it identifies the starting point as the Somerset vision, North Somerset vision that I just referred to, refers to the sustainable, inclusive, safe, healthy, prosperous communities. And it says to achieve the vision, the SCS has developed 6 shared priorities, and we can see 4th bullet point down, improving health and well-being. And then it says at 2.4, the role of the core strategy and other planning documents is to provide the spatial land use expression of these shared priorities. You see that?
Yes.
So the core strategy is seeking to provide the spatial and land use expression of the 6 shared priorities, which include improving health and well-being.
Yes.
Right. And so we would expect the core strategy to include policies which promote the improvement of health and well-being in order to deliver those priorities. Yes?
Yes.
If we then go in this document, please. Hang on, I managed to shut it down. Yes, if we go to page 7 of the PDF, please. We've got the index of policies here. And we can see there's a group of policies under the heading Living Within Environmental Limits, Delivering Strong Inclusive Communities, Delivering a Prosperous Economy, Ensuring Safe and Healthy Communities. You see that?
Yes.
And within that rubric, that title, we can see CS25, CS26 and CS27.
Yes.
So one can see that the spatial priority that we were looking at is effectively delivered by these 3 policies.
Yes.
So let's go please to CS26. Now we should have that, according to my notoriously unreliable notes, page 102.
Yes.
And here we have CS26. It says the planning process will support programs and strategies which increase and improve health services throughout the district, promote healthier lifestyles and aim to reduce health inequalities. This will be achieved through, and then number 1, it says requiring health impact assessments on all large-scale developments in the district that assess how the development will contribute to improving the health and well-being of the local population. Now, that is a policy that requires large-scale development to produce a health impact assessment which demonstrates how that large-scale development results in improvement of the health and well-being of the local population.
Yes, well, that assesses how that development will do that, yes.
And that's because it is a strategic objective of the core strategy, as we've seen, that development should improve the health and well-being of the local population.
Yes, and I would say that the 3 core strategies, CS 25, 26 and 27, between them demonstrate how the authority sees that strategy being delivered.
And so it follows, doesn't it, Mr. Pearce, that if the appeal scheme before the inspectors in this inquiry does not achieve that objective of improving the health and well-being of the local population, it will be contrary to policy CS26 of the core strategy.
I don't think that follows. I don't think CS26 sets a requirement that every development should actively contribute to improving the health and well-being of the local population.
No,
I'm
you're
sure
right, it doesn't say that. It says the large-scale development should.
Okay, even so.
You don't think it says that?
I don't see that it says that every development, large-scale development, must inherently contribute to improving.
I see. Well, where is the policy then in the core strategy that delivers the vision and the priority that we just went to in section 2, if it's not CS26 part 1?
Certainly this is part of the way in which that vision is delivered, yes.
Sorry, I don't think that's an answer to my question. Which other policy delivers the objective of improvement of health and well-being from development if it's not CS26?
Well, the three policies that you've mentioned, so including CS26.
So, right, so CS26 does have that as an objective for development?
An objective, yes.
Yes, okay, fine. Just to finish this point off, since it came up in cross-examination of Dr. Broomfield, let's turn on, please, to page 104 of the PDF and to look at 3.320. The first few lines talk about HIA being an important tool. Public authorities and developers alike increasingly need to consider how policies and strategies will impact on the health inequalities. And it says this: a health impact assessment can identify the potential health gains and potential risks to health and help identify additional measures to reduce or avoid these risks. This policy requires HIAs to be submitted with applications for all major development within the district. Now, what that is saying is that HIA helps to identify additional measures that you can require development to provide. Yes?
Yes.
And the only way to require additional measures from development is either by imposing a planning condition or requiring a provision in a planning obligation. You accept that?
I believe that's correct, yes.
Right. And planning conditions can only be imposed on planning permissions where they are necessary.
I believe so.
And necessary in that sense means necessary to make the development acceptable in planning terms.
Yes.
You can only do that in relation to additional measures if there is a policy in the core strategy that requires it. Would you agree?
I believe so, yes.
And so what this sentence does when you unpack it is it supports the approach that I put to you a few moments ago, that CS26.1 can only be interpreted as requiring large-scale development to contribute to improving the health and well-being of the local population.
Well, as you said in your previous question, it requires that they be acceptable.
And if large-scale development doesn't contribute to improving the health and well-being of the local population, it will be contrary to policy CS26.
Possibly.
And the way in which you can repair that breach of policy is by then, if you can, produce mitigation, which is imposed by way of condition or planning obligation. That's what 320 is saying.
Yes.
Right, thank you. All right, let's just look at the mitigation that's proposed in a little bit more detail. We've touched on some aspects of it. In your proof at page 19, I think you referred to the three elements: the realignment of the roads, the junction of Downsize Road and West Lane with the A38. And let's start with that. Now, are you aware that as part of its case in relation to the compulsory purchase order, the council has presented evidence that it intends to undertake improvements to that junction in those locations in any event?
I wasn't aware of that, no.
Right. In that case, I better take you to it. You need to go in the inquiry library, I'm afraid, to the CPO proofs, and we're looking for Mr. Lansdowne's proof.
One moment, I'll have to retrieve this.
You've got plenty of time because I've got to get there too.
Is that on behalf of NSC?
It's CPO proofs, and it should be in the. You should see Conrad Lansdowne under the North Somerset Council heading.
I'm not sure I do.
The CPO proofs are in a separate folder.
They're in a separate
Thank
bit.
you.
Look on the
Scroll
right.
down, yeah.
That's where I'm looking wrong.
Thank you.
Okay.
I want to take you to paragraph 2.9 when you
So,
got the document.
sorry, Conrad Lansdowne's proof of evidence.
Yeah.
Okay, give me a moment, please.
And if we turn in his evidence, please, to PDF page 5.
Okay.
He explains about the A38 MRN scheme, and he explains that's separate from BAL scheme, addressing current issues experienced by road users along the A38 corridor. The funding is 85% from the DFT, remaining 15% funded locally, subject to approval of DFT funding. And it says it includes 2 proposed transport improvement interventions on the A38 in the immediate vicinity of Bristol Airport, and they are between West Lane and the airport roundabout, and between the airport roundabout and the Silver Zone. Now, my instructions are that those improvements address the same issues that you're referring to in your proof at page 19, paragraph 4.6.1.
It sounds like it.
Yeah. Now, if it's right that these road improvements are coming forward anyway, any air quality benefit that would be delivered from these road improvements will be delivered even if planning permission were refused.
That would appear to be the case. I don't know when this MRN scheme was brought forward.
Right. And if that were right, if the benefits would be delivered even if permission is refused, then those air quality benefits can't be ascribed as benefits of the scheme. That would be right, wouldn't it?
Yes, if they would happen anyway. Presumably, I believe that BAL is proposing to fund them under its own thing. Don't quote me on that, but I believe so. So that may count as a mitigation on BAL's behalf.
Okay.
But otherwise, yes, your general point is taken.
Yeah. Now, in terms of the surface access strategy, let me ask you some questions about that. Does Bristol Airport Limited already have a surface access strategy?
I believe it's been developing one over the years, yes.
It's been developing one?
I believe so.
Okay.
I'm not the transport witness, so.
All right. Now, in terms of the surface access strategy that's proposed in association with the appeal scheme, I just want to understand where we've got to with the drafting of that. Has that been drafted and produced to the inquiry?
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
Has it been drafted and produced to the inquiry, the form of the surface access strategy, or is that another work in progress?
I believe there's a draft available.
my instructions are that there is no draft surface access strategy that's been produced that would be adopted in the event that planning permission were granted for the appeal scheme yet. Is that your understanding?
I'm not sure, to be honest.
Okay. Fine. We can't take that much further. All right. I think I've only got 2 more short points to put. Uncertainty in the fleet mix. Dr. Broomfield and you have both looked at this issue. And it's right to say, isn't it, that if the Jacobs fleet mix materialised, then there would be an increase in emissions and an increased impact on ground level concentrations.
On my assessment, there would be an increase in concentrations of PM 2.5, but a decrease in concentrations of NO2.
Right, thank you.
In a small improvement in NO2 and a very small increase in PM 2.5.
And so if Bristol Airport Limited is to be held to the impacts that it's identified in its environmental statement and in the environmental statement addendum, some form of control would have to be imposed that precluded a fleet mix along the lines of the Jacob fleet mix from coming forward.
I don't think it would be reasonable to require them to meet every single concentration change at every single model receptor.
Right, okay. So I'll take that answer.
I think the key point is that the overall assessment in terms of the significance of the impacts would not be changed, and that would be a reasonable thing to hold BAL to.
Okay, thank you. Now, ultrafine particles, I think where we've got to is that ultrafine particles are effectively a subset of PM 2.5, because PM 2.5 is everything from 0 microns up to
Yes.
2.5 microns. We've agreed that it's not possible to carry out a quantitative assessment.
I'm sorry, that's agreed, yes.
That's all right. I think you've accepted that the health impacts of UFP are unknown at the moment.
Yes, there is uncertainty about them, but
Yeah.
as you say, they are a component of PM 2.5, so it is reasonable to assume that the health impacts of ultrafine particulate are included within the effects of the health effects of PM 2.5.
It's also right then that if you drive down emissions of PM 2.5, you also drive down emissions of UFP.
You would expect so, yes.
And so if one were concerned about the uncertainty of the health effects associated with UFP and wanted to do something about it, one could take heart from a decision to impose requirements or obligations to reduce PM 2.5, that those two would reduce the risks of harm from UFP.
You could do. You could similarly, if you were similarly worried, you could take heart from the fact, from an assertion that the impacts of the change of PM 2.5 was negligible, and infer that the change in ultrafine particulates is negligible.
Yeah, okay. All right, thank you. Now, I think last point, the air quality action plan, you've said in your evidence in chief, I think, that it's not necessary.
There is the proposed policy requirement under Aviation 2050, which we discussed earlier. I don't consider it necessary at this stage as a result of the conclusions of the ESA. I think it would be desirable, if consent were granted, to develop one, and that would be an appropriate time to do so.
I see. All right. So if the view were taken, contrary to the views that you've expressed, that there is a policy requirement to drive down emissions of NO2 and particulate matter, it would then, wouldn't it, become necessary to impose a condition requiring an air quality action plan to come forward? Because
That would be how we would deliver such a change, yes.
It would be necessary because, as you've seen, and you've presented the data, the grant of planning permission for the appeal scheme results in an increase in emissions. Yeah.
Just so.
Okay. Thank you very much. Right, thank you very much indeed.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. I've got one question for you, and I'm putting my local resident hat on here, okay? So you've accepted that if there's a grant of planning permission, there is increased exposure to air quality, but in the ESA terms, it's not significant.
Yes, in the EIA terms, it's not significant.
Yeah, okay. And there's been a consistent concern from local residents, and this is for the whole EIA process and the report of salami slicing. A concern at the airport is chipping away, you know, just with incremental increases all the time. So, you know, it's not just levelled at yourself. We've talked about it a lot in the other topic sessions, but it's not come up so far in air quality. So in terms of air quality and your point of view as expert, what's your position in terms of the salami slicing concern raised locally?
I understand why they would be concerned, the fact that, you know, a few years ago there was an 8 to 10 and now there's a 10 to 12. That is, I agree, not really optimal. It's the nature of, I guess, of the evolving and really quite volatile aviation demand that's experienced. So yes, I understand their concerns. I would reiterate that, you know, this needs to be seen against a background of improving air quality. Air quality has been improving steadily. To be honest, it's been improving steadily since the 1950s with the Clean Air Act. It stalled a bit in the early 2010s, but is now continuing to improve. And we expect over the next decade or so that overall air quality will be, ideally I'd be out of a job, but that's perhaps a bit ambitious. But yes, it is continuing to improve. Dr. Broomfield is quite right to register concerns that there is increasing concern about low levels of air quality, and I would not be surprised if, to be honest, if air quality standards do tighten up in future, specifically with regard to PM 2.5. But I think, yes, on the whole, the picture is a good one. And again, I say, you know, even with the expansion to 12 million passengers, that will not overturn the picture of improving air quality.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Humphreys, do you have an estimate of how long you might take for re-examination? I know it's this $1 million question.
I mean, we're sort of 1:45 now. I'm thinking sort of 30 minutes, maybe 40 minutes, if it just takes a little longer. I don't think a vast amount, whereas previously I've had to go to a lot of documents. I don't particularly need to do that, and that tends to be a little bit faster. But so I'm in a sense, for Mr. Pearce's sake, I'd rather just sort of get on with it, and then we have a clean start tomorrow.
Mr.
if
Pearce,
you're
are you
happy with
happy
that.
to continue? And is everyone else in the room? There's no. We're dropping like flies. I noticed actually it's getting emptier and emptier. But, okay, we'll continue. I don't want to really go past 5:30
No,
if possible.
I
Mr.
don't
Humphreys.
think we'll do that.
Okay, thank you.
You were, in fact, picking up a point that sort of reflects the inspector's last questions and your points about improving background levels. You said, I think, that the Euro 6C classification came in 2016. Correct me if I've got that wrong, but I think you said 2016.
I think that's the correct year. It's 2016, possibly 2017.
And you raised this in the context that it was put to you that, you know, in some of the locations around the, or on and around the airport, air quality levels had been fairly flat for a while, but you also said that air quality is now beginning to improve again. What other people looking at these things think is going to happen with the greater sort of percentage in the vehicle fleet of Euro 6 and then the entry of electric vehicles into the vehicle fleet over time? What's expected to happen?
An ongoing improvement, clearly, in air quality, especially around roads. All the cars that are now on sale are very low emissions, and electric cars will be even lower. They will certainly have no zero tailpipe emissions. So, you know, by 2030, I would expect pretty much every car on the road to be Euro 6C or electric.
And we know, and again, I can't remember the precise date, that there's a date beyond which I think diesel and
Yes,
I think petrol vehicles may not be
so no new sales beyond 2030.
2030. So obviously it doesn't mean that all those vehicles will disappear overnight, but again,
Over the 10, 15 years, certainly, yeah.
what is expected to happen to the fleet and what's expected to happen to air quality levels?
Yes, again, continuing improvement longer term.
And you told us that your forecast for 2030, even with the development, was for air quality levels lower than 2017. Why is that?
Because of because of what we've just been discussing, the ongoing reduction in emissions especially from cars, and from other sources, including, you know, domestic sources, are also continuing to tighten up in terms of their emissions, all of which is contributing to the reduced background. And also, again, on airport measures such as, you know, the ground support equipment fleet especially is becoming lower emission over time.
And during earlier topics in the inquiry, a lot of other parties have suggested that growth will in fact be slower than the core case, the case to 12 million in 2030. If that was to happen, again, what would you expect to happen to both the PCs and the PECs in your various tables that we looked at?
Yes, so I discussed this briefly in the ESA, and I would expect that reaching 12 million passengers per year in a later year would mean that the air quality in every year up to then would be better. So as the background continues to decline, when you do reach 12 million, whether that be in 2034 or whatever, then you would expect overall your impacts to be lower.
So let's assume we get to 12 million in 2030, but even with the airport at that level, what happens by 34?
Well, yes, once there's no further growth at the airport, you would expect that to continue to improve.
And then there were questions about there being no threshold below which there is no risk, and this was asked in the context of the air quality standards and objectives for PM 2.5, but we know you've looked at effects below the air quality standards and objectives, and what are the conclusions if one goes that extra mile and looks at things below the standards? What does the assessment tell us?
Well, looking at the impacts even below the standards within the limit values, we're finding very small impacts, which overall are not significant.
And you were taken through pretty much the whole of Dr. Broomfield's section 4 on policy, and at the end of that, is there any policy requirement to reduce air quality emissions for any of the pollutants that we've been looking at?
I can't see that there are any documents, any policy documents that set a requirement for every development to reduce its air quality, to have negative or beneficial effects on air quality.
And insofar as policy may look for improvements over time, will the air quality levels with the proposed development be better than the data for which we have, the year for which we have data, 2017? Will there be an improvement?
Yes, there will be a continuing improvement at almost every receptor.
You were then asked in CD 6.5, it was page 84, it was that text. I might look it up myself so that I don't misrepresent what it says, but I think suggest everyone does it unless they particularly want to.
Sorry, what's 6.4?
6.5.
6.5, the Aviation 2050.
Yeah, it was PDF page 84, and it was the third bullet point, requiring all major airports to develop air quality plans to manage emissions within their local air quality targets. And that's under the heading proposed measures, and is proposing the following measures. Government is proposing those. What does that, if that's a proposal, what does that tell you then about the current policy position and whether there is a current requirement that you have to have an air quality plan?
Indeed, one must conclude that there is no current policy for that, policy requirement for that.
You came on a little later to be asked about the plan, the air quality action plan, and you may recall when we were looking at the planning practice guidance, again I'll give the reference, CD 8.26, PDF page 7,
which says that mitigation has to be proportionate to the effects. You were asked about why there wasn't currently a plan, why there was no action plan, and one of the answers you gave was, well, there aren't any significant effects. Again, how can we understand how did it come about that there isn't an action plan? Do we need to look at the officer's report? Can you remember what the officer's position was?
The officer's position was that the impacts were acceptable. I forget the exact quote. It might be worth looking it up.
Let's just look at the officer's report. So CD 11. Do you have? What did I say? 11.
Yep.
Sorry. CD 4.11. You could be there as my constant number dyslexia friend. I'd be very grateful. So page 83.
I have it.
And this is towards the end of the section on air quality, so just above the heading Issue 8, Surface Access Strategy, the sentence immediately above the end of the conclusions, to ensure this remains the case, ongoing monitoring will be required together with an air quality action plan to improve air quality. This can be secured through a Section 106 legal agreement. So was that what officers were requiring of the airport?
Yes, that is their suggestion of the way to deal with it.
And if we want to look at, because it's now being proposed as part of a condition, I think it's condition 16, but if we want to see the formulation of the 6 months, if we turn on in that document to page 232. Again, this is what we were being asked for, and therefore why one wasn't produced. An air quality action plan will be produced no later than 6 months after the commencement of the development. So, you know, at that time, was there any suggestion, any requirement from the council that they needed something immediately?
Before then, no, not that I'm aware of.
And again, as part of this whole line of cross-examination to do with policy, you were told about there being a policy to drive down emissions, but there is an increase, it was put to you. We may be an increase, but is there a significant increase?
No, there is an increase, but it is negligible for most pollutants and at most receptors, and overall not as significant.
And then you were taken to policies about the vision and objectives of improving health and well-being. Will health and well-being depend purely on air quality, or are there wider factors?
No, for example, the vision talks about health, and then the next word is prosperity.
Yes.
Prosperity and socio-economic improvements feed very strongly into health. Obviously, I'm not giving evidence on health, but it's well established that those are factors, and so the overall health impacts need to be considered in the round.
Now, we know, we'll probably come to it tomorrow, that the conclusions of the health impact assessment was that the proposed development will bring about health benefits at a population level. Let's just look at that in the context of policy CS 26 again. So go back to CD 520. And page 102.
Sorry, 520.
5.20. CD 5.20. I have got that right. It's the core strategy.
I have it, I've just temporarily forgotten where I filed it. Oh, so, this is the one with two numbers, isn't it? I've got it under 5.6.
Yeah. And go to page 102.
Yes.
And we've focused on criterion 1, requiring health impact assessment. And we have one of those, and the council is making the point that that requires improving health. Okay, let's take that at face value. Let's look at then what the policy says if you have a health impact assessment that shows improvement. The planning process will support programs and strategies which increase and improve health services through the district, promote healthier lifestyles. So if we have a health impact assessment that shows a positive outcome, as we do, what does policy CS 26 say should happen?
That suggests that the development is contributing to improving the health and well-being of the local population.
Yes, and what will the planning process do? It will support such programs.
Yes, it will.
And then you were asked about whether there is an existing ASAS. There is, it's CD 7.4. It hasn't been updated because ultimately, you know, to update it, you would need to understand what's going to happen, the outcome of this appeal. But again, let's go back to the attitude of officers to a new surface access strategy and what officers want. Again, we've been criticised for there not being a surface access strategy, so let's go back to CD 411 to understand why one wasn't produced before. So 4.11, let's just turn to page 146.
Yes.
Have I written down the wrong page? I might have. I just need to check this. I think I've just scribbled down the wrong page. Forgive me for a moment. Oh, sorry. No, I have got it right. I have got it right. Sorry. Recommendation.
Yes.
Subject to A, the referral of the application to the Secretary of State, and B, the completion of a Section 106 legal agreement securing a new airport service access strategy. So, again, what, in our discussions with the council officers, what was anticipated?
Clearly, the officers are expected that the existing surface access strategy to be updated as part of this, as part of a Section 106 agreement.
Thank you. Done very well.
You have, Mr. Humphreys. Thank you.
In time. No comment
Yes,
on
there we
anything
are.
else.
Yes, to be clear, thank you. Okay, all right. Thank you, everyone. We're back on track with the timetable, thanks to everyone today. So thank you to Mr. Humphreys and to Mr. Taylor, just to be fair. We've got the condition session on Friday. The majority of that will be noise because there's more noise conditions. There's the one condition in terms of air quality, as far as I'm aware. You might correct me if I'm... Okay, yeah. Having gone through the process today, both, I like setting homework, so if you can get your heads together and just see if there's any more common ground, any changes you might want to make, just to reflect the discussions, just in anticipation of that session. I think, are you both going home and will be attending virtually, or?
That was my intention.
Yeah. I don't need you to be here. I'm just sort of wondering, because I think what we'll do is we'll do air quality first then on Friday morning, and then you can leave the noisy lot to it. so yeah, that's fine. Okay, all right. Well, if you can both get your heads together, and if there are any amendments, obviously via the programme officer, send them in.
Also ask you to look at Stan's decision, look at the approach to conditions there, and in particular the inspector's comments about the air quality conditions. Whether you disagree with it or not, and you look at it, and that can help you out, hopefully. Okay.
Mr. Humphreys.
Madam, yes, I think Mr. Pearce is going to be remote, and I think Mr. Williams is going to be remote. I don't know whether you have an expectation of time for this. Part of the reason why they were going to be remote is they come from a distance, and if it was a relatively short thing, I won't hold you to your time estimate, but I just
Now it's been turned round, isn't it?
but I just
That's clever, Mr. Humphreys.
I'm sure you'll get your own back, but we've assumed that this is not expected to be an all-day event, and therefore it's not worth calling someone from a great distance for what is likely to be a focused discussion.
It will be, our taxi is booked for 1 o'clock in the afternoon, to be frank. So it's only an interim conditions discussion.
No,
I don't anticipate it being more than a couple of hours at the most.
That was my expectation.
Obviously, we're in your hands as to how well you work together, and and how clear the explanations are to us if we have any queries and questions. But I don't want to thrash out 5 conditions on a Friday.
Just to help out, it's going to be conditions 16, 18, 19, 21, 24. That's 16, 18, 19, 21 and 24 primarily, because that's where I've identified there are disagreements. There are other noise conditions, but on the table I've got, I think, which is the latest one, there's no disagreement on some of those others. So they're the big ones, and particularly the air cap, the cap on movements. That's a particular one that we want to thrash out.
Does that help?
Yes, it really does help.
Yes.
And, don't hold me precisely to 2 hours if we go over. Lovely. Okay. Well, thank you. On that note, are there any other procedural matters? No. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. A good session today. Tomorrow it's health, and that's a fairly short session, but that will actually give us the afternoon to prepare for conditions as well, which will be useful and fruitful. So we'll close today 5:05, and we'll reconvene tomorrow at 9:30. Have a good evening, everyone. Thanks.